Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna go on and share my screen then. Okay, and I hope everyone can see my screen as well. Thank you.
Yeah, screen is.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter, for the introduction. My name is Adebimpe Adegbite. I'm a grad student at Tulane University. Presently, I'm in Nigeria, though. I'm doing my classes remotely. So today I'll be speaking on Proverbs as a useful resource in heritage language learning. This idea or this research I began nurturing in 2017 while I was a Fulbright scholar at Florida Memorial University in Miami, United States. So basically I had interactions with heritage speakers of the language, parents especially, and saw the challenges they were having with teaching their children Yoruba in a secondary setting, being the United States. And so I took into consideration the challenges they were having and the need. And because, of course, I was interested in Proverbs, I wanted to see how Proverbs could be used to teach Yoruba language. I believed this would be more interesting in terms of like the interestingness of Proverbs, and sought to see how this would work. So this presentation is a theoretical part of a research that I just recently secured some funding to do later next year, and to see how this will translate to real life if this is carried out. So some introduction background to the study. Language education acquisition are quite complex, and because we're not only talking about the linguistic competence in this case, but also the social and cultural competence. And in a lot of instances, when you're talking about heritage bilingual speakers or heritage speakers, they require more effort in terms of learning a language because they are not in the host environment. And a lot of other factors contribute, especially when the second language isn't a common or popular language in the host environment. So of course, language is of germane importance in terms of an individual's identity, especially for immigrants, for example, because it remains part of them. And most immigrants, in this case, Yoruba immigrants in the United States, really want to keep their language. And I did see this while I was in Miami in terms of various ways in which parents tried or attempted to ensure that their children keep up with the knowledge of the language. Part of that include naming, in terms of the names given to the children. So you could, because Yoruba has a peculiar naming system. And so you could identify a Yoruba person by the name. In fact, you could trace some part of their family history by the name. So of course, I could see that parents were indeed interested in having their children learn the language. And so in this theoretical part of this research, I tried to propose a way to teach children Yoruba language using Proverbs in a way that they understand the linguistic part and at the same time the social part. So the language itself and the culture, especially in terms of technology, politics, religion, health, and economics. So a little background on heritage language maintenance. So in the US, according to Nestroke, children from various national origins and backgrounds become monolingual a lot of times, especially in this case. I wouldn't want to generalize too much. I'll be restricting my my assumptions to Yoruba language. So most of them become English dominant by the time they reach adolescence, because in the US, for example, the language they mostly use is English. And it's a problem because even in Nigeria, a lot of children are growing up being English monolinguals, English being the official language here. So it's a worse case in the US. So the education level of immigrant parents often determines how the children are able to keep or being bilingual. So if they have high levels of education and income, there's a high probability that the children would only speak English language, of course, because they're probably be in the middle to the high section of the social ladder, and they would perhaps need only English to move within the society. So heritage language loss typically takes place across 3 generations. So if we are going to trace from immigrant bilinguals, that is the parents that perhaps travel from Nigeria to the United States, who in this case would be bilinguals, and then they have children, which would be the 2nd generation, and those children would be limited bilinguals because now the host community begins to interact with the language proficiency. The parents still speak Yoruba language, so they get a little of the language, but because they don't really use it, they become limited bilinguals. And then the 3rd generation are basically monolinguals, because now the 2nd generation mostly use the English language. So the 3rd generation pick the English language as monolinguals, and they have very little to no experience in terms of Yoruba language. But then if the 1st generation are able, that is the migrant parents, are able to get a conducive linguistic and social pool of resources, and the 2nd generation end up being balanced bilinguals, then the 3rd generation would also be bilinguals, and that would actually transfer to following generations. Then a little exposition on family language policy and planning, because this research basically is at the level of the family, which is like the basic unit of a society. And in my research that I will be doing, or the practical aspect, I'll be working with some families to see how they can actually work using some family language policy and planning methods to ensure that the children are kept being bilingual, and for me as well to see how this actually works. So family language policy is a sort of planning that is overt and explicit in relation to language use in homes. So a lot of multilingual, and of course nowadays all countries, I wouldn't want to generalize so much, but a lot of countries, or most countries, are multilingual. So a lot of European countries, for instance, have language policy and planning. They have these policies that ensure to see how languages are used in a way that bilingualism ends up being a blessing rather than a curse. So the field of family language policy emphasizes balance in the use of languages within the family. So the policies to put in place, the things to do within the family to ensure that the children, especially the children, are bi or multilinguals. So for instance, you could have immigrant parents in the United States, and it's possible, perhaps the mother or the father understands another language, say Spanish, to have English, Yoruba, and Spanish, and the children in this case would be multilingual. So we can actually look at family language policy from 3 areas. 1, the language ideology, the belief, actually. Language practices, the things that are done to preserve the language or to manage the languages involved, and the language management. So family language policy is a driver for maintenance of heritage language. So to actually keep, because when you say heritage language, it means it's in a non-host environment. So to keep a heritage language, there is need to maintain a good family language policy, because unless there's a great family language policy in place, then the host language typically takes the day. Parents play important roles as facilitators of a consistent family language policy. And of course, in my research, parents will be playing a crucial part in terms of ensuring the children follow the, I would say, lesson plan to actually see if this experiment would work. Now I'll move to Yoruba proverbs. So Yoruba proverbs, like any other proverbs, have their foundation in folk literature, in culture, tradition, and social norms. So it's a form of narrative language, and as such, it codifies the language. It also codifies the culture. So my goal is to use proverbs to teach the Yoruba language and the culture at the same time, because it can. So functionally, Yoruba proverbs can be divided into 8, which is part of a book I'm presently working on because of this project, essentially. And for this paper, 1,000 proverbs are analyzed into categories to determine the relevance of proverbs to heritage language teaching. So there are these 1,000 proverbs analyzed into 8 categories, and these categories are expatiated in teaching material in the form of like a book, where I construct like a lesson plan to see how teachers and parents can use this material to follow up with children being bilingual or heritage speakers of the language. So these 8 functions here, the first one, Yoruba proverbs are used for sympathy and encouragement. So there's this proverb, bí ènìyàn kò dé ibi ìsinmi, ìdí kì í bá ilẹ̀ ṣe ọ̀rẹ́. Until a person reaches a resting point, the buttock does not befriend the ground. That is, you don't sit until you achieve your aim. So that's sympathy and encouragement. There's a section on caution and advice. Ari eni kọ́gbọ́n, ari èjì kọ́gbọ́n, ẹni kò bá fi ọ̀rọ̀ ara rẹ̀ kọ́gbọ́n ló gbọ́n jù. So you have people, basically this is saying the wisest are those who learn from others' experiences. So when you take others' experiences into consideration, then you probably wouldn't have the same problem. The third category on morality, character soundness, and uprightness. So if you go into a forest, for instance, and you keep mute, the idea here is birds would excrete on the person, perhaps thinking you're a tree stump or something, because you're not moving and you're not talking, and so you're just going to be like any other tree. So this means you actually have to show yourself. If you have a good character, then people should see that. It's like the equivalence of the most harm is done by those who keep quiet in the face of injustice. And so you have the proverb on reproach and punishment. The first act of kindness is never as grave as the retaliation. You have cooperation, care for others, and the interdependence of individuals and corporate groups. And a lot of these proverbs have stories attached to them. So sometimes a non-native speaker might not understand what they actually mean in the connotative sense without listening to these stories and see how this relates. So this is an interesting part of Yoruba proverbs, which I hope to use in the research. You have the 6th category on settlement of dispute, responsive leadership, where you talk about elders. Elders are really valued in Yoruba culture, and it is assumed that an elder or an older person is supposed to pave way for others. So if you're going over a bridge and then you destroy it because you're going somewhere, you'll definitely have to return. And when you're returning, you're going to have to figure out a way to cross the river. And the eighth category is entertainment and comedy. So you have all these categories, and you have proverbs that are purely for entertainment and comedy. Others are like instructive. And also all the proverbs that we'll be using in this research are divided into one of these 8 categories. And those are the categories that I'll be using in the lesson plan for the children. So language education using Yoruba proverbs. Of course, here I look into how parents can help in terms of children learning the proverbs in this category. So there are 5 reasons proverbs are relevant in language and citizenship education, according to Woodson. So they provide insight into events or personalities, which are not amplified by textbooks. They provide different points of views and also pose exciting questions. They also encourage children to use thinking skills, because you don't only use the denotative meaning, you have to think about the connotative meaning as well. They illustrate the complexity of cultures, and proverbs bridge the cultural values gap between African and other Western cultures. So they, of course, help the children to learn their culture and be able to see that vis-a-vis the American culture in this case, I mean, when in the United States, vis-a-vis the American culture, and see the similarities and perhaps not so differences that exist there. So the suggested steps to see how this works, or to make this work, outline at least an hour each day for children to learn new proverbs, or discuss proverbs that have been learned. So basically in the research, I'm going to have like a study session to like bring all the children together, teach them some of this proverb, use this lesson plan that I'm going to prepare. And so when the children go home, these are the steps that the parents would be taking, or that the parents will be helping with, to ensure that we get a good result out of this. Second one, increase the use of proverbs in communicating with children, and of course be ready to provide the meaning of the proverbs. So of course the parents would be required in a way to have an idea of what these proverbs are and what they mean. So when children become familiar with the proverbs, have them discuss the local and global implication. Children, of course, should keep a vocabulary journal. This is important because it's not just the social part of the proverbs, also the linguistic part of the proverb. So to do occasional tests on the knowledge of this journal. So of course you could give gifts, you could give rewards. Children should also have journal for the collection of proverbs. Parents should supervise these and be sure that they are familiar with functional categories. Parents should provide historical information where applicable, contextual information as well. Stories, there are stories for some of these proverbs that are historically based. And you could have games and activities that exemplify the use of these proverbs. So you have some of these proverbs, for instance, Omodigbon Agbagbon Lafidale Ife. So the joint wisdom of children and adults are important in the creation of the land of Ife. The land of Ife, or Ife city now, is the ancestral home of Yoruba people. So the meaning of this proverb is children and adults are important in building a community or a state. You could have a role play in this instance. Also, proverbs should be extended to practical fields, as in physics, agriculture, technology. For instance, Lala Toroke ile lumbo, whatever goes up must come down. That is physics. And you have other proverbs on agriculture, technology. And so this helps to contextualize the language for the children.
Ade, you have 2 minutes to go, Ade.
So conclusively, thank you. This study, of course, has demonstrated the relevance of Yoruba proverbs in household teaching and learning of Yoruba language. Again, in practical terms, I'll be seeing how this works. And this process requires a positive attitude on the part of parents. So from my conversation with parents while I was in Miami and while I was in Syracuse, New York as well, I see a lot of parents are actually interested. They just seek the resources to be able to do this, because this, of course, will no doubt require parents to be actively involved. So further studies on proverbs and family language policy can take the form of an empirical research, part of which I will be doing, I hope to do later next year. And so these practices will be evaluated to see if these steps and proverbs in general actually work to improve the bilingualness of children, especially heritage bilingual speakers or heritage speakers of the language. And I do hope that, I mean, if this works well for Yoruba, it might be able, or should work as well for other languages that have proverbs foundational to their linguistic system. And I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Okay, Ade, thank you very much. That was excellent timing. If anybody has any questions or comments, if you could indicate that in the chat, please, that would be really helpful. And could I just make a comment, which is the area that I live in, London, Yoruba, I hear Yoruba spoken every day. I catch the bus and I hear people speaking Yoruba. And there's quite a lot of activity that's happening in terms of attempts to looking at heritage maintenance. And I wondered if you were familiar with or had looked at the situation in London, perhaps as a comparison to your United States study.
Not really. I haven't really done that. But even in the United States, there are some parts of the of New York where there are huge population of speakers of the language. But then we have to evaluate like speaking between, say, adults to maintain like social relationship and actual communication within the home. So you have like immigrants speaking the language to in terms of social relationship with friends or other immigrants, but then mostly, oftentimes, the children still grow up to be monolinguals because that is thought to be needed for social engagement.
Okay, very good. Christina Rengel has a question, which is, how did you manage to collect 1,000 proverbs?
Yes, so I actually looked through television broadcasts, radio stations, newspapers. I spoke to some elderly people, the wise ones, so to speak. So from various sources, from books as well. And of course, so there are other books on proverbs actually, but something about this was, besides those I gathered by communicating with people or listening to media, I also sought for some that were like modern proverbs, because of course, proverbs take on their own identity and evolve with time. So I also have modern proverbs that are not, that have recent history, for example. So yes, from various sources.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Sarah Round. She wants to ask, in what other ways she said, you've made the point that they're foundational for understanding the culture and the oral literature. In what other ways language?
Yes, so
is there something particularly linked?
So one is the vocabulary of the language, the vocabulary system. Proverbs are excellent in teaching this. Another one is in terms of like the history, the etymology of the language, of the word especially. So oftentimes you find in Yoruba proverbs words that are differently used or not so used in normal Yoruba communication. And then you begin to wonder the discrepancy. So proverbs do more of a historical codification than the actual day-to-day speech, which easily evolves with time. So in terms of tracing the history of words, proverbs are also essential in this. Yes, basically, so in the aspect of vocab, in the aspect of the history of the word. And of course, I do also believe that in expressly teaching the other linguistic patterns of a language itself, proverbs can also be used, even in cases where proverbs don't expressly teach those parts.
Okay, fantastic. Evans Luara wanted to know whether proverbs are incorporated into mainstream language education or curricula within Nigeria itself.
Very low. So I mentioned in the beginning that there's a problem even within Nigeria in terms of the competition between English and other languages. We have, of course, 3 national languages: Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa, and 400 plus other minority languages. But even within Nigeria, there is this notion of English as being the important language for social engagement and social movement. So to a low extent, in fact, to talk about the Yoruba itself, it's low. Talk less proverbs, which is like going really deep into the Yoruba language. So the incorporation is quite low.
One thing I was curious about is the use of these kinds of expressions for political purposes. You find in lots of places, and I'm thinking of Indonesia, which I'm familiar with, where if you want to criticize, political figure, you can use one of these proverbs without directly referring, and everybody knows, oh, so-and-so is, the crocodile or the elephant. Does that happen with Yoruba as well?
Absolutely, absolutely, I agree with you. And it's a two-way thing. So just as you've said it, one way, and political figures also do that, especially when probably they are seeking votes or they intend to communicate with the grassroots. They also do use proverbs.
So they actually can be really useful as a way of understanding political ideologies as well as the kind of cultural aspects that you focused on. So I can see you've highlighted how important they can be as part of language and cultural learning.
Of Mongolia. The subject of my presentation is some lexical properties in the dialects of the Xinjiang Oirats, who transitioned from the nomadic culture to the settled culture based on some examples. The presentation keywords are Xinjiang Oirats, idioms and idiomatic expressions, nomadic culture, settled culture, and language changes. For the study on some properties of the Mongolian nomadic culture through language facts, a question on the subject of the study must arise. For this question then, J. Bainsa answered, there are many kinds of sources for the study, ranging from teachings such as folk tales, hymns, epics, folk songs, to some fixed expressions such as proverbs, idioms, idiomatic expressions, and riddles. The social integration and disintegration that took place in the land of Mongolia hundreds of years ago caused big differences in the dialects of Mongolian language and the earlier transition of some Mongolian nomadic tribes to the settled culture. Describing the properties of 2 dialects of the same language in 2 different countries, as well as 2 different cultures and social relations through some examples of idioms and idiomatic expressions is a part of the study on dialects. Therefore, this paper firstly aims to introduce the language situation of the Xinjiang Oirats, and secondly to describe the language properties and change through some semantic and lexical changes in idioms and idiomatic expressions of two different dialects within the same language. Firstly, in order to introduce the language situation of the Xinjiang Oirats, I would like to elaborate on their citizenship, place of residence, population coexistence and mixed life of ethnic groups, economic situation and history. They have settled down in Tekes County, one of the 8 prefectures of the Uighur and Khasag Autonomous Prefecture, which is under the Xinjiang Oirats Autonomous Region in the northwest of People's Republic of China. It is located in the northern foothills of Tinger Mountain, in the eastern part of the Tekes River basin, the upper reaches of the Uighur River at the eastern tip of the Xinjiang. According to 2018 census, the population of Tekes County has surpassed 170,000. The ethnic minority population has reached 140,000, accounting for 81.5% of the total population. The biggest ethnic group are the Kazakhs, accounting for 44.5% of the total population. Chinese are second with 18.4% of the total population, whereas Mongols accounted for 2.6% of the According to 2018 census, the population of Tekes County has surpassed 170,000. The ethnic minority population has reached 140,000, accounting for 81.5% of the total population. The biggest ethnic group are the Kazakhs, accounting for 44.5% of the total population. Chinese are second with 18.4% of the total population, whereas Mongols accounted for 2.6% of the total population. Of the 18,000 Mongols currently living in Xinjiang, more than 5,000 live in Tekes County. The researchers consider Old and Targot dialects to be included in Oirat dialect to their predominance in population of the Tekes Mongols. Among the various interpretations of the meaning of the word Tekes, 2 have scientifically been based on researchers' opinions and language facts. One is the word Tih, or male wild goat in English and the Turkic-related languages, and another is a changed pronunciation of the Mongolian word Tish. During the Galtın-Başak War, or at the end of the 17th century, the Oirat tribe disbanded. A group of them moved to Tibet and Huknur, another group assimilated into Old in the east, and the rest traveled to the Idil River and rebuilt the Hure with the support of Uighur Khan. The Mongols in Tekes County are the descendants of the disciples of Hotot Giganzai Bandit and his disciple Altargach, who returned to their homeland with the Targots in 1771 under the leadership of Obashang. In 1772, during Qianlong Emperor's reign, various people from Old Tashot, Targut, and Durut tribes were settled down in the lower basin of Tekes River. There have been a number of studies on Mongolian idioms and idiomatic expressions, as well as comparative studies with other languages, including monographs. In addition to them, there have been thousands of source materials, related to Xinjiang Oirat idioms, and other works related to the Xinjiang Oirat language and culture. Idioms are constantly changing over time in the way of getting newly formed on the one hand and becoming gradually obsolete on the other hand. As the Xinjiang Oirats had become bilinguals and mixed linguals due to living together and neighboring other ethnicities, the influence of various cultures have altered the idioms and idiomatic expressions over a long period of history. Through this article, the authors used a dictionary of idioms entitled Монгол хэлтсийн далай, compiled by Proverbs, published in Inner Mongolia as a basic source for idioms and idiomatic expressions spoken in modern Xinjiang Oirat with an alternative vocabulary, or understood with different meanings from which were described in the source, or those which are now completely incomprehensible. Dalai in the Mongolian language means ocean in English, but we have a proposal to use treasure for the Dalai instead of ocean in this article and translate Монгол хэлтсийн далай as treasure of Mongolian idioms. A questionnaire about the idioms in Treasure of Mongolian Idioms dictionary was conducted with 20 Oirat participants aged 18 to 42. In accordance with the aforementioned methodology, we have chosen more than 500 idioms from the dictionary by Proverbs and are proposing classification of the idioms as idioms spoken with different vocabulary in Xinjiang Oirat, idioms with the same vocabulary but changed meaning, idioms with Oirat dialect words, idioms mixed with Chinese, Uighur and Khasag vocabulary influenced by coexisting cultures, and idioms with literal translations of Chinese, Uighur, or Khasag words or cultural influences. Following historical and political events, the nation's cultural, linguistic characteristics undergo changes. In the case of Xinjiang Oirats, they have had many idioms and idiomatic expressions which lost or shifted their meaning due to their settled culture, trade, translation from other languages. Of them, I would like to explain a few. An idiom maldarach, which means to herd animals to the pasture, to divert grazing animals, to underreport the number of animals, in the Treasure of Mongolian Idioms by Proverbs has been used with a single and different meaning to load animals onto a truck in Xinjiang Oirat. An idiom ungtatach, which means to line gowns or to shine in the relevant dictionary, means to make friend in Xinjiang Oirat. An idiom Uighur, which means to drive the cattle into the pasture in the dictionary, has been changed to Uighur, which means to take the cattle out of the fence in the Xinjiang Oirat's usage, due to the transition of the pastoral livestock breeding to the settled farming, of the pasture land to the personal ownership, and of the feed of the cattle in the pasture to the one in the fence. Another example of the fact that the nomadic culture or livestock breeding is disappearing and some language properties sourced by the livestock breeding are fading away, an idiom, hensorok, is not used with its basic or literal meaning, but with its figurative meaning, like the youngest child or single child in Xinjiang Oirat. Apart from this kind of examples used, there are hundreds of idioms which cannot be completely understood in Xinjiang Oirat, like an idiom in the dictionary cannot be understood with the meaning of to stay in an open air, or to spend a night outside using the mountain ridge as a pillow by the Xinjiang Oirats. An idiom hilam solach shachach describes to ask so many questions for someone without any pause. In the dictionary is used with the mere meaning the meal is delicious in Xinjiang Oirat. In other words, the Xinjiang Oirats started eating spicy food due to the influence of foreign cultures, and the burning sensation felt when eating spicy food was compared to the tongue almost getting pulled out. An idiom, "qar tavach," meant to feel peace, a formal version of a word to fight, to respect, or to take a great care, not to do something personally, to give up, or to sign in the dictionary has been turned into the meaning to sign or to steal in Xinjiang Oirats. The fact that some foreign or loan words, conjunctions, and sentence structures seem to be more strange to a person at first, a kind of an anomaly, is an indication of the predominance of associations and analogies of the native language. But once you get used to the phenomenon, this anomaly disappears. This lexical anomaly also affected the Xinjiang Oirats language. For example, instead of an idiom, which means stubborn, an idiom is used in Xinjiang Oirats. Means no grass grows nearby in English. However, a concept or household encampment in English can no longer be understood like or all for one and one for all in English with collective social identity. Metaphorically comparing the character stubborn as the idiom no grass grows nearby reveals that the vocabulary and style have become non-anomaly to settled culture household, isolated from the Mongolian nomadic lifestyle, which let them move away in pursuit of fresh pasture. An idiom which means to despise or to reject the little stuff after seeing a bigger one, or to neglect your own after seeing others, is the same as an idiom. The others becomes a young lady, mine becomes an old woman in Xinjiang Oirats. For the names of bigger animals like deer, bull, the names of 5 kinds of livestock used in the idioms and idiomatic expressions in the dictionary, the names of smaller animals like insect, bird, dog, and donkey can be substituted in Xinjiang Oirats. That means the original idioms have completely been changed like the aforementioned idiom. For example, a couple of idioms, which means to make a small thing like a goat be a bigger thing like a camel, and or thousands camel slips on one camel's droppings in English, which means much more people will be victimized by one person's mistake, are equivalent to the idioms or to get the hat on one's head, get his head instead in English, and basa tatsach or to throw your feces, make your luggage dirty in English, respectively in Xinjiang Oirats. Another interesting thing we have observed is the fact that the attitude of the Xinjiang Oirats towards other ethnic groups was reflected in their idioms, as they had learned the characteristics by living next to or together with them over a long period of history. For example, an idiom which means to show a bad temper or behavior, is or ortus devil moves in English, or or simply his or her ortus moves in English in Xinjiang Oirats. An idiom which means to be disappointed or frustrated in the dictionary, is an idiom which means to be like a Hotan who is deeply in-depth in English in Xinjiang Oirats. Some idioms and idiomatic expressions kept the properties of the Oirat dialects. Of the studies on the Xinjiang Oirats idioms, particularly the Oirat dialects and the idioms, have the historical change of the Mongolian language and some relevant facts on the local dialects account for a considerable proportion. One example of them is an affricated phoneme Z in halt, pronounced as a stop consonant D or T in Xinjiang Oirats, like halt tarах, halt murultach, and halt hargaltach. In addition, Halk dialect O is pronounced as E in the Oirat dialect, e.g. Suhuch is pronounced as Sihich. Some idioms and idiomatic expressions influenced by the Uighur and Khasag language and culture. Since the Xinjiang Oirats live together with the Uighurs and Khasags and often conversed in Uighur and Khasag vocabulary, numerous instances of Uighur and Khasag words occur in Xinjiang Oirat idioms. Firstly, there are some examples of the Uighur and Khasag words directly included as a constituent in the idiom structure. In idiom айлчин хүн готолгүй, архичин хүн зоосгүй, which means no shoes for a guest and no coins for an alcoholic. In the dictionary is expressed as to lose their shalpar in Xinjiang Oirat. Shalpar refers to a type of pants. In idiom усан могоо харах, which means to shoot a water snake, in the dictionary describes very fast, is su mogoo in Xinjiang Oirat. The us or water in English is su in the Uighur and Turkic languages. In idiom humsa zusa mishishik, or like a mishi biting its nail in English, expresses the meaning of to show diligence and carefulness. Mishi is an Uighur word or cat. In idiom nura barch, or to lose one's face in English, is substituted with atura barch, or to lose one's atur in English, the meaning of to lose one's honor. Atur is in Turkic Uighur word. But an expression sohortzas, or single coin in English, is substituted by sohortin, and zatrazas, or small coin in English, by parcha in Xinjiang Oirat. Secondly, there are some idioms influenced by the Uighur and Khasag culture. In other words, the following examples show how the vocabulary related to the livestock breeding in idioms and idiomatic expressions are turned into ones related to settled culture. In idiom, алга зарга унж байгаад алга зарга ирнэ, which comically describes the situation, to look for your spotted stallion while you are riding on it, in the dictionary is substituted with илжиг унж байгаад илжгээ хаах, or to look for your donkey while you are riding on it, in English, using a word ilchik or donkey in English instead of atzraq or stallion in English in Xinjiang Oirat, with the meaning of to forget completely or to not be able to find something next to themselves. The word donkey is commonly used by Buresh. In idiom арилгасан сармас арчсан тойл, or a peeled garlic wiped mirror, which means a clean and neat person, is арчсан алам, or a wiped apple in Xinjiang Oirat. In idiom алам ишнээсээ холоодохгүй, or any apple cannot be far from its stem, has the same meaning with an idiom ихэн хэр алга бол хүн шир алга, or if the mare is spotted, then the foal is also spotted. And this is only a few examples of the hundreds of idioms using the word alam, or apple in English, because the Uighurs and Khasags have traditionally farmed apples. In idiom, mal khurach is an example of a few idioms which use the word mal, or animals, in English, even though this word does not mean the 5 kinds of Mongolian traditional livestock, but property in the Xinjiang Oirat dialects, like in the Turkic related languages. Some idioms and idiomatic expressions influenced by the Chinese language and culture. Firstly, there are some idioms in the Xinjiang Oirat lexicon which are literally translated from the Chinese language. For example, in idiom or to make a backdoor in English, is literally translated from the idiom, which means to bribe. There are also literal translations of Chinese four-character idioms. For example, or one word, one motto in English means to have the same idea. Secondly, the idioms used in Chinese loanwords make up a significant percentage of the Xinjiang Oirat lexicon. For example, in idiom, "bagahach" means to pay off the debt. The word "ba" in this idiom is of Chinese origin, which means debt or tax. In idiom, "Xinjiang or to run water underneath a shan, a quarrel. The word "shang" means a grain rice rig, and then the idiom means if you run water underneath it, it will rig. Among the idioms and idiomatic expressions influenced by the Chinese language and culture, the rate of vocabulary related to meal or food is quite high. For example, in idiom or to come to the end of one's number of breaths, which allegorically describes to die in the dictionary by Bruntos, is to come to the end of one's numbers of meals. In Xinjiang Oirat, some idioms like hagarham or cracked mouth in English, bortskidsen or lord of cookies in English, and botanetolum or a leather bag of rice in English all mean someone who eats a lot in Xinjiang Oirat. Thirdly, under the influence of the Chinese culture, the nomadic cultural meanings of words and idioms has become unclear or has disappeared. For example, in idiom nahoho, which describes animals moving in pursuit of fresh grass at the beginning of spring, in the dictionary is not used in Xinjiang Oirat. This seems due to the fact that the word naho, or greens in English, is no longer used and understood with the meaning of grass and herbs, but only refers to vegetable. In idiom, Batkhishig Sangidorj, which means to become poor, in the dictionary is which means to have no property or possession, but merely a home in Xinjiang Oirat. Here, home used bashing, or literally house in English, whereas in nomadic cultures, people would use gir, or Mongolian traditional yurt in English. Conclusion. The principal purpose of this paper is to introduce the language situation of the Xinjiang Oirats, because aside from the Oirat dialect speakers who live in Mongolia, a large number of Oirats are also living in People's Republic of China. Some of them live in Uighur, neighboring Tibetan language and culture. The others live in Gansu province in some parts of Inner Mongolia, such as Asia, where the Chinese language and cultural influences are predominant. The third group lives in Xinjiang. The relationship of the Xinjiang Oirats with the Khasags and Uighurs in the language and culture is unique. The influence of the Chinese language and culture cannot be neglected here as well, as they live in the territory of China. Looking at the lexical properties emerged from the transition from nomadic to settled culture through two dialects within the same language, firstly we can see that the vocabulary of the Xinjiang Oirat dialect has been altered by many words directly loaned and translated from the Uighur, Khasag, and Chinese languages and influenced by the culture. Therefore, this kind of study is of great importance in studying on the situation and process of endangered languages and dialect changes and in determining their facts. The The fact that the Xinjiang Oirats have substituted the words related to herding and animal husbandry with ones related to settled culture in idioms and idiomatic expressions, and have not understood or recognized such kinds of words, show that the dialects which the Oirats in the west of Mongolia who make nomadic life and Oirats in Xinjiang who prefer the settled culture are insulated from each other, and even though it has been included in the same classification as a branch of the Oirat dialect which belongs to the Mongolian language. The Xinjiang Oirats are also considered as having an animal husbandry culture, but theirs is a settled animal husbandry, and the contrast to the nomadic culture is reflected in their language and idioms that continues to develop under the influence of neighboring cultures. According to our study, there are a comparatively large number of Xinjiang Oirat idioms which are absolutely different from ones in our source, Treasure of Mongolian Idioms by Buruntos, a collection of idioms and idiomatic expressions found in the Inner Mongolian dialect, published in Mongolian script, and which have not been completely and partially understood by other dialect speakers in China, and particularly the Outer Mongolian speakers. These are the main source and references for this presentation. Thank you for your attention. I am looking forward to your comments and questions.
Okay, this is Rita. I'm going to stop the recording.